At the time of its debut, the Skoda Octavia A7 received completely new engines of three families: EA211, EA888 and diesel EA288. Old units were not installed on its modular platform. Actually, new engines are also considered modular, i.e. are maximally unified with each other and installed with the exhaust manifold backwards. In general, what really pleased the Octavia A7 was its engines. There are no bad units among them. All problems with chains and other ridiculous engineering miscalculations were avoided by these motors. However, the oldest Octavia of the third generation is already 10 years old, and it is unlikely that you will find a copy on the secondary market with a mileage of less than 150,000 kilometers. Therefore, some mechanical problems still make themselves felt. And yes, the third generation Octavia, like all its predecessors and relatives in the VAG group, still needs to check the oil level weekly. Why didn't the engineers build an oil level indicator? It is as necessary as a fuel gauge. 1.6 MPI, CWVA. The most common engines on the third generation Octavia are gasoline engines. Among them there is one naturally aspirated engine with distributed injection, 1.6 CWVA 110 horsepower. It appeared on the Octavia at the beginning of 2014 and belongs to the EA211 family. It was developed specifically for the customs union market, so as not to shock buyers with basic 1.0 and 1.2-liter turbo engines. By the way, the aspirated engine was created precisely on the basis of a turbo engine. The 1.6 MPI is a completely normal engine. It lasts more than 300,000 kilometers, but in most cases, it eats up oil. 100 to 200 grams per 1,000 kilometers is normal oil consumption for this engine. If consumption is higher, then it's time to think about replacing the piston rings. Unfortunately, this type of work on the CWVA engine is becoming more and more in demand. The oil burn appears precisely because of the tiny size of the oil scraper rings. Once you overexpose the oil, it immediately deposits in the rings and interferes with their normal operation. The only protection against oil burn is to change the oil every 10,000 kilometers or more often if the car constantly drives in traffic jams. It is necessary to use oil with VW 502.00 approval. Moreover, experienced owners do not like oil in original jars. It degrades too quickly. If the naturally aspirated 1.6 MPI for the Octavia A7 starts clicking with the hydraulic compensators after a cold start, this indicates a decrease in the oil supply in the sump. In the long term, hydraulic lifters may simply wear out. When operating this engine, you need to keep an eye on the pump, which is installed at the rear of the cylinder head and is driven by a separate tooth belt. This pump is modular, consists of a light alloy body and a plastic cover, and has two thermostats. Antifreeze leaks occur both at the junction with the cylinder head and from under the plastic housing. Leaks are eliminated by replacing the appropriate gaskets. The pump itself will need to be replaced when the mileage exceeds 200,000 kilometers. The original costs $350, but there are many substitutes of varying quality. Let us add that on CWVA engines produced in 2014 and 2015, the phase shifter was changed during the recall campaign because the defective one simply unscrewed or fell apart. 1.4 TSI. Another very common engine on the Octavia A7 is the 1.4 TSI, CHPA, CHPB, CZDA, 140 and 150 horsepower. This is the EA211 family, i.e. there is a timing belt drive and a minimum of problems. Yes, you need to monitor the oil level. Yes, you need to keep an eye on the pump. It is the same as on the 1.6 MPI engine. In addition, VAG engineers did not quite successfully design the turbocharger wastegate flap axis. It can jam, after which a powerful electromechanical actuator will break the damper rod. To prevent the wastegate axis from jamming, you need to lubricate it with a special heat-resistant grease, GO52112A3. Let us add that 1.4 TSI engines, as well as 1.2 TSI, with a timing belt drive until September 2013 were produced with a defective cylinder head. Due to a manufacturing defect, oil flowed into the cylinders from under the valve guides. This problem and the wild Mauslöcher were solved under warranty. There should be a corresponding note in the service book, 1.8 TSI. There are also a lot of Octavia A7s on sale with a 1.8-liter turbo engine, CJSA, 180 horsepower. This is the third generation of the EA888 family of engines. Believe it or not, this engine is no longer inclined to consume oil, although lubricant consumption may become apparent after a mileage of more than 100,000 kilometers. And in some cases, oil burns can be cured by installing a latest revision oil separator and means for decarbonizing the piston rings. The timing chain still needs to be monitored. It stretches across 150,000 kilometers. We just replace it with a new one and move on. The intake valves do not become overgrown with carbon deposits, because fuel injection in this engine is combined. There are nozzles for direct injection and for injecting fuel into the intake manifold in front of the valves. In the turbocharger of the 1.8 TSI engine, the adjustment of the wastegate actuator sometimes gets lost. Adjustment is made by rotating the nut and monitoring the adjustment using diagnostic software. There are also cases of wear on the wastegate bushing. We have that early 1.8 TSI engines had problems with the front supports, O6L103-144H of the camshafts, through which the oil channels pass to the phase shifters. The end parts of the camshafts were worn out, which could be heard from the rattling of the phase shifters. The pump of the 1.8 TSI engine is also driven by a separate belt. It has an electrically driven damper and a thermostat built into it. Many engines, the pump leaks along its plastic housing. A new good quality pump costs more than $500. A non-original thermostat can be purchased separately for $100. The cooling system of this engine has a valve 4H0121671B that directs heated antifreeze to the automatic transmission radiator in order to heat the transmission fluid faster. This valve caused problems for everyone, both Skoda owners and Audi owners who chose the 1.8 TSI and 2.0 TSI engines. In this valve, antifreeze leaked through the electrical connector, followed by errors in the transmission thermostat. The original valve costs $150. There are replacements. In general, you need to keep an eye on this valve, because antifreeze through its wire can reach the electrical connector on the ECU. Electrochemical corrosion easily destroys pins in this place. Otherwise, the 1.8 TSI engine, especially after 2015, is a decent and problem-free unit. But he does not tolerate the garage style of service. Only qualified service and oil changes should be frequent, every 7,500 kilometers. 1.6 TDI CLHA, CLHB, CRKB, 90, 105, 110 horsepower. 2.0 TDI CKFB, CRVC, CKFB, CUPA 143, 150, 184 horsepower. Skoda Octavia is much less common with diesel engines. These are two very similar engines, the 1.6 TDI and 2.0 TDI of the EA288 family. We have a detailed review of the 1.6-liter engine. You need to understand that these engines are equipped with complex environmental systems, but in general they do not create serious problems. In the first years of production, many Octavia A7 models with 1.6 MPI and 1.4 TSI engines made a knocking sound when driving over bumps. The knock came from somewhere in front. Then it turned out that it was the radiators that were shaking in the upper supports. 1K012137M. These brackets were not screwed to the supporting frame TV in any way. They were replaced with new supports, which were firmly screwed to the frame. The Skoda Octavia A7 was equipped with two 5-speed options. Manual transmission MQ200-0A0 off and MQ250-0A4. Both have weak differentials, wear of the bearings of which leads to a hum and wear of the secondary shaft support bearings and even the differential drive gear. To extend its service life, you need to refresh the transmission oil every 80,000 kilometers. 6th Street. The mechanics of the MQ350-02Q do not create any problems. Let's talk about automatic transmissions. The classic automatic transmission on the Octavia A7 can only be found on the naturally aspirated 1.6 MPI version. This is the 09G transmission, also known as Aisin TF61-SN. A good transmission. To extend its service life, you need to keep the heat exchanger clean and change the ATF every 60,000 kilometers. If there is insufficient cooling, this transmission begins to kick when shifting. Also, the micro switch in the selector of this automatic transmission often fails. Its malfunction does not in any way affect the performance of the transmission and the car as a whole. Only a message appears on the instrument panel indicating the need to switch parking mode. Under warranty, the entire selector assembly was replaced. Then the craftsman selected a micro switch that can be installed to replace the worn one. All other 2-pedal versions of the Octavia A7 are equipped with pre-selective transmissions. The 7-speed DSG is the DQ200 unit, but in a greatly improved modification, 0CW. This transmission has a dry clutch that lasts more than 150,000 kilometers and costs $400. When worn, the clutch slips, shocks appear when changing gears, and an error indicates wear. If you continue to drive with the emergency clutch, the dual mass flywheel will fail prematurely, which will cost $430. Problems with the dry DSG hydraulic unit are possible with a mileage of more than 300,000 kilometers, and repairs will cost about $400, i.e. much cheaper than restoring the valve body of a classic automatic transmission. Improvement 7 Street DSG brought it one weak point: the body of the mechatronics accumulator became thinner, and cases of cracking appeared. If you have such a problem, you will have to look for a used one or buy a new mechatronics. The 6-speed DSG DQ250 0D9 with a wet multi-plate clutch was installed only in conjunction with diesel engines. Paired with gasoline engines, it was only available with all-wheel drive. The DQ250 is the best and most durable of all VAG pre-selective transmissions. It lasts a very long time. It needs to change the oil every 60,000 kilometers. The hydraulic unit is repaired by replacing relatively inexpensive solenoids. When driving aggressively, it often turns the bearing races on the shafts. But this transmission is repairable. By the way, the DQ250 transmission differential can fall apart due to inadequate slipping on the spot or attempts to drift. There are all-wheel drive Octavia A7s, primarily the all-terrain Scout version. The drive to the rear axle is connected to a 5th-generation Haldex multi-plate hydraulic clutch. This coupling requires careful maintenance. Every 30,000 kilometers the oil in the clutch must be changed. There are drain and fill plugs on the body. To replace, you need 600 grams of special oil, GO55175A2. At every second oil change, you need to remove the electric pump, clean it and change the filter. The VAG concern does not imply such a procedure in principle, so the filter must be purchased from the Volvo 31,325,173 or Ford catalogs. The kit will cost $50. Without such maintenance, the Haldex coupling will fail. Moreover, its electric pump becomes a victim, but the clutches often remain unharmed. On many Octavia A7s, the brake master cylinder had to be replaced. The initial symptom of its wear is a decrease in braking efficiency, and the brake pedal becomes weak and sinks. When examining the brake cylinder, it turns out that air is being sucked into the hydraulic line through its seals. The suspension of the Skoda Octavia A7 turned out to be reliable, although on cars of the first years of production the rear shock absorbers fogged up prematurely. They were replaced under warranty. Updated rear and front shock absorbers last 200,000 kilometers. All suspension parts last more than 100,000 kilometers and are generally more durable than on the A5 generation Octavia. Even the front stabilizer struts with plastic elements last a very long time. The support bearings of the front shock absorber struts on the Octavia A7 are more massive than on its predecessor. Stabilizer bushings and steering ends required replacement after a mileage of more than 100,000 kilometers. The remaining suspension parts serve for 200,000 kilometers. Original front control arm ball joints are sold separately. Literally all versions of the Octavia A7 are equipped with a rear suspension with a transverse beam, the so-called semi-independent suspension. Here there is literally one silent block per beam. Their service life is literally endless. Cars with a 1.8-liter turbo engine are equipped with independent suspension. Fans of this model consider this completely independent chassis more comfortable and controllable. The beam is considered noisy. Well, there are no comrades according to taste and color. At the same time, rear independent suspension does not cause trouble and does not create costs for its maintenance. All silent blocks of the rear independent suspension are detailed separately. The body metal of the Octavia A7 is well protected from corrosion, but the paintwork is weak. It scratches, chips and can fall off in whole flakes in those places where the chips have begun to grow. But in general, Octavias retain their elegant appearance for a long time. It has been noticed that the heated windshield on the Octavia A7 gets scratched quickly and severely. Unfortunately, nothing can be done about this. Severely scratched glass will have to be replaced.